You'd think sitting was simple, but in 1860, for certain women, it was practically an act of protest. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight we explore the world of women who lived corseted lives physically, socially, and quite literally. Their chairs had springs, their shoes had no heels, and their breaths were rationed one tight stitch at a time. A pinch here, a tug there, a waist squeeze to a wasp's silhouette. The morning air carried the scent of starched lavender water and ironed linen. Sounds dainty until you realize that the laces on your corset are about to remind your lungs who's in charge. Why did anyone agree to wear a garment that turned breathing into a calculated luxury? And why did no one question what that meant for everything else? If you're the kind of soul who finds rebellion in tailoring and quiet power in posture, maybe like and subscribe. I promise the only pressure you'll feel here is the weight of a velvet curtain. Wondering if you had to dress like it's 1860 tomorrow morning. What's the first thing you'd quietly refuse? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up in 1860. You're not just getting dressed, you're entering battle with fabric. The first opponent is the chemise, a linen underlayer meant to keep your actual clothes from touching your skin. Then come the drawers split at the center for reasons no one talked about out loud. After that, the corset. Whalebone, tightly laced and stitched not just to reshape the body, but to reinforce what society considered respectable. A properly laced corset didn't just cinch it, sculpted. Women's fashion magazines advised waist reductions of several inches, and young girls were often laced early to train the body into submission. Some doctors warned of displaced organs. Others claimed corsets promoted proper digestion and moral uprightness. Scholars still debate how much harm was caused versus how much was exaggerated by moralists or misogynists or both. Bodices were fitted like armor, skirts ballooned with crinoline cages, steel hoops, and layers upon layers of petticoats. Altogether, a typical ensemble could weigh over 15 pounds, and once-dressed women weren't expected to do much other than still stay pleasant and stay within the frame. A chair without arms was ideal. You could perch on it delicately, but don't lean, don't slouch. Don't forget, posture is not just about elegance, it's about obedience. There's something quietly tragic in the design of these clothes. The corset was both prison and performance. It promised beauty while denying ease. It offered structure while erasing softness. And yet many women embraced it, some even felt empowered by the silhouette. Was it self-expression, internalized control, or simply survival in lace a peculiar detail? Some corsets had hidden pockets, tiny ones, just large enough for a watch, a coin, or a note, secrets stitched into constraint. One wonders how many whispered plans or hidden words rested against a woman's ribs. The symbolism was everywhere. You were literally tied up before you'd spoken a word. And yet, inside that cage of seams and steel, there were thoughts, dreams, resistance. Maybe not loud, but steady. The morning sun casts long shadows through lace curtains. The house is still, but your day has already begun, because in 1860, the morning didn't start when you woke up. It started when your duties remembered you existed. First, you boil water, not for tea yet, but to wash. Linens are scrubbed by hand, dried on lines, then re-starched and pressed so sharply they could hold their shape without a body. Your fingers, red and raw, will look presentable by breakfast. If you manage to avoid the stove burns or scalding soap. Next, hair. Yours must be brushed into ringlets or coils depending on the day and how far your arms can reach behind your head. Some women sleep in rags to preserve curls. Others employ hot irons heated by fire. No temperature control, just skill and prayer. A single misplaced lock could draw judgment. Eyebrows too arched. You're vain. Hair too flat, you're neglectful. Every follicle speaks before you do. And then comes the corset again. If you're lucky, you have a maid or a sister to pull the laces. If not, you twist awkwardly, elbow jammed against the wall, breathing in short bursts between tugs. By the time your dress is over your head, yes over, you've already been up an hour sweating under wool and cotton and shame. Breakfast is served once you're nearly faint, not at a table but in posture. You must sit straight, elbows and ankles crossed. No buttering both sides of the toast. That's vulgar. And don't reach ever, a lady asks. A servant serves. But if you're the servant, then you've already eaten or will later, or not at all. This routine wasn't indulgent. It was expectation masquerading as elegance. Even leisure was labor. To be idle correctly took effort. Some called it genteel, others insufferable. Researchers continue to debate how much of this ritual was internalized versus enforced. The truth likely lies between the teacups and the ticking clock. Here's a lesser-known tidbit. Upper-class women sometimes train themselves to faint on cue, a gentle swoon convenient during unpleasant conversations or when overwhelmed by emotions real or rehearsed. Fainting wasn't weakness, it was punctuation. The house echoed with quiet rules. Don't rush, don't complain. And above all, don't show the work. A smooth forehead and steady hand were the goals. No one wanted to see the pinpricks, the burns, the corset marks. The goal was effortlessness, performed by women who worked relentlessly to appear as if they did not. Curiously, women's diaries from the era rarely mention these tasks. Some speculate they were too routine to note. Others think they were too painful. Boiled linens again doesn't stir poetry, but it tells a deeper truth. How many histories were lost because they felt too small to write? And so, your morning ends with an exhale you didn't know you'd been holding. You smooth your skirts, check your hair in the mirror, and prepare to be seen, though rarely heard. Another day begins. Already halfway done. The air in the parlor smells like rosewater and expectation. You've barely digested breakfast, but the main course of the day is already being served marriage. Not the act itself, no, not yet, but the careful preparation, the constant rehearsals. Every look, every letter, every lace-trimmed hem is a step down the aisle. You aren't choosing a partner, you're being selected. Your job is to be agreeable, attractive, and above all available. At dances you must smile without smiling too much. At church you must pray without drawing attention. At home, your sewing must be dainty but visible. And when callers come, pour tea, not opinions. Marriage wasn't a surprise, it was the script. For most women in 1860s America, it wasn't if, but when. And once it happened, your life changed. Though not always for the freer. Some women hoped for love, others for stability. Many simply hoped for someone tolerable. Scholars still debate whether the majority of these unions were partnerships or polite imprisonments. It wasn't about affection, it was economy. A woman alone was suspicious. A woman married was respectable. But the choices were few. Wealthy suitors came with rules, poor ones with risks. And if you weren't married by a certain age, you became an old maid, a phrase sharper than any corset stay. Here's a curious fact. Engagement rings weren't standard yet. Instead, suitors often gifted brooches or lockets. Some even sent braided locks of their own hair, woven into jewelry to wear over your heart. Sweet. Or slightly unhinged. Depends on your threshold for sentimental DNA. Once married, your role became narrower still. No more late-night walks. No more personal correspondence. Your identity shrank into your husband's name. Even your letters were often signed with his initials. And heaven forbid you voiced an opinion in public. That was considered improper, or, worse, unfeminine. The idea of wifely duty loomed large. And it wasn't just about keeping house. You were expected to soothe, to manage to smile, to be the emotional support system for a man who might not know your favorite flower, but expected supper on time. Love letters were rare, grocery lists constant. Still, some women found small joys in the structure: a tidy home, a steady rhythm, the occasional moment of quiet. Others chafed at the limitations. Their journals reveal subtle rebellions: a book hidden behind the Bible, a friendship kept secret from a disapproving spouse. In the margins, history whispers. And yet, so much went unsaid. The silence of these women is deafening, not because they had nothing to say, but because their words weren't preserved. One wonders how many women invented clever solutions, crafted quiet jokes, built lives inside cages, and were never remembered. Marriage in the 1860s was both pedestal and prison, a place to be protected, a place to be hidden. You walk through the parlor now, corset-laced smile, fixed in wonder, not for the first time. Who would you be if no one expected you to be anything? The ink on your marriage certificate might as well be an eraser. The moment you say "I do," you begin to vanish, not just from your maiden name, but from the law itself. In 1860s America, a woman's legal identity was fused entirely into her husband's. You are no longer you. You are his. Your wages, if you had any, now belong to him. Any property you owned, be it a field, a house, or a particularly well-behaved goat, is legally his. Even your children, should you have them, are not really yours. Legally speaking, you become what the courts charmingly called civilly dead. Scholars still argue whether the legal doctrine of coverture was more about control or convenience. But, to you, the result feels like a vanishing trick without applause. Curiously, this legal sleight of hand came with strange contradictions. A woman couldn't sign a contract, but she could be held morally responsible for her husband's debts. She couldn't vote, but was expected to uphold the moral tone of the home, the neighborhood, and society at large. No seat at the table yet, somehow responsible for polishing it. And if your husband mistreated you, divorce was an option only in the most extreme circumstances, and even then, it brought ruin. Women who left their husbands risked losing everything: their home, their children, their reputation. Better to stay invisible than to be labeled scandalous. Some women found loopholes, of course. A rare few kept assets in the names of brothers or fathers. Others operated small businesses in secret under assumed names, or the cloak of a male relative. One tailor's wife in New York kept her dress shop open for years using a ledger, signed only M, a ghost with a needle. There's an odd historical footnote here: the rise of women's clubs in the late 1800s. Sewing circles, yes, but also informal law schools, financial seminars, and publishing collectives. In parlors across the country, women exchanged recipes and legal advice. They couldn't sue, but they could educate. The idea of identity itself became a tightrope. You were someone's daughter, then someone's wife, and if fortune smiled, someone's mother, but rarely just someone. Diaries from this era are often unsigned, not because the writer lacked pride, but because too many names had already been taken. In some cities, widows had more freedom than wives. Free from coverture, they could own property-run businesses, even vote in a few Western territories. Which raises a slightly morbid question: was the most empowered woman in 1860 the one whose husband had conveniently passed on? Still, not all stories were grim. Some marriages functioned as partnerships, flawed, yes, but filled with quiet mutual respect. These were the exceptions, not the rule, and history rarely recorded them. But they remind us that even within erasure, sparks of selfhood endured. So you move through your day legally non-existent yet fully present. You manage a household, direct staff, raise children, host neighbors, all without a signature to your name. And somehow, despite the legal silence, your voice lingers in recipes, in letters, in stories passed down like heirlooms. You are idle, but never still. A visitor might glance at your embroidery hoop or rocking chair and assume you've nothing to do. But that's the magic trick of 1860s womanhood, appearing restful while working endlessly. You're not just resting your feet. You're stitching the hem of a dress, reviewing the pantry inventory, and composing tomorrow's guest list in your head. Society warned against female exertion. Doctors of the day advised against too much walking, too much reading, too much thinking. A woman's mind was thought to be delicate like fine china that might crack under stress. And yet, the labor never stopped. You managed the servants, soothed the children, cleaned the parlor, repaired the linens, prepared for guests, and ensured the soup didn't curdle, all without straining yourself. Some historians argue that this contradiction, work disguised as leisure, was a feature, not a flaw. By keeping women busy without appearing productive, the system reinforced their place useful but not powerful, ornamental yet essential. Here's a peculiar detail. Fashion magazines of the time often warned women not to read too much, especially novels. Too many stories, it was claimed, could unsettle the nerves. And heaven forbid you develop strong opinions or worse, an interest in politics. That was a job for your husband or your brother or the local vicar. Your role was to smile, nod, and maybe pour another cup of tea. But idleness had its rituals. Afternoon visits had to be timed, just so, never too early, never too late. Calling cards were left at homes with meticulous handwriting. Faint floral perfumes lingered on gloves that were always worn even indoors. Even the act of waiting on a porch swing or near the drawing room window became a performance of poise. Some women leaned into the charade. They cultivated the art of doing nothing with style. Fans were flicked bonnets, adjusted parasols, twirled, but others resisted in small ways. They took up causes quietly, of course. They wrote letters to editors under initials. They organized charity events that doubled as planning meetings for things more radical than soup kitchens. A fascinating tidbit in some cities, women joined philosophical salons where debate was encouraged, provided it was hosted in a tasteful setting, with acceptable refreshments. You might discuss Plato over lemon cakes, but the real revolution was hidden in the footnotes. Servants, of course, knew the truth. They saw the backaches, the late-night sewing, the unpaid planning. The lady of the house might be called idle, but her schedule was anything but. She simply wore her fatigue under silk. The term invisible labor hadn't been coined yet, but it was already everywhere. You kept the household functioning, the children cleaned the linens crisp, and did it all in silence. No applause, no paycheck. Just the faint praise of being a good wife. So, you rock gently in that chair, needle in hand, eyes half closed. To the outside world, it's leisure, but inside you're a storm of lists, decisions, memories, and quiet strength. And maybe a single radical thought. Your stomach aches, but you don't mention it. A crimson dot stains the muslin lining of your undergarments. You fold it away quickly like a secret letter. In 1860, menstruation isn't spoken of, it's endured, quietly, privately. Preferably behind closed doors, under bed covers, and never during polite company. The euphemisms are endless. Your monthly visitor, your time of unwellness, your womanly turn. Some simply say indisposed. Victorian medicine treated menstruation less as biology and more as malady. Bed rest was prescribed sometimes for days. Vinegar rinses and lavender sachets were offered, but real comfort rare. Medical understanding of the female body was generously speculative. The uterus was blamed for everything from hysteria to headaches. One doctor suggested women avoid books during their period. The mental strain could redirect vital energies. Some physicians even proposed that menstruation made women temporarily unfit for decision-making conversation or religious participation. Researchers continue to debate whether these theories were sincerely held or convenient tools of control. And then there were the treatments, leeches applied to the thighs, herbal tinctures, some laced with opium, sitz baths where one perched delicately above steaming herbs, hoping the heat would relieve the cramps without scandalizing the maid. None of these came with instructions, just whispers from mother to daughter, or tips exchanged behind fans at garden parties. There's a strange intimacy to it all. Your body becomes both a burden and a cipher. Pain is normal, but never acknowledged. You might confide in a sister or a friend, but only in euphemisms. And if your husband notices your pallor best, to blame the weather. Curiously, some women use the sick room as an escape. A few days seclusion free from chores and conversation could be a small mercy. But others felt imprisoned, trapped in bed, while their duties piled up just beyond the door. One woman's diary from the time describes the sensation as a monthly haunting. Sanitary products were handmade rags boiled and reused. Safety pins replaced modern adhesives. Corsets already restrictive became unbearable. Women often had to modify their dress or suffer in silence. A misplaced pin could mean a blood stain on a silk chair, a disaster for appearances. And yet, these private struggles rarely made it into public records. Menstruation was excluded from history books, medical journals, even letters. Not because it didn't matter, but because it was too ordinary, too uncomfortable, too female. It happened every month for nearly every woman, and still managed to remain invisible. Some women, of course, rebelled, quietly. They wrote coded notes, stitched cryptic embroidery, and passed down herbal remedies that worked better than the doctor's brandy. In some rural communities, midwives carried generational knowledge about the cycle, understanding its rhythms in ways the city clinics never could. So, tonight as the cramps tighten and the world tells you to smile through it, you lie back in your bed, not for rest, but because rest is the only allowed response. You are not weak. You are managing a storm with grace no one sees. Your fingers are sore from embroidery, but it's not the needlework that exhausts you. It's the silence. You sit in a drawing room surrounded by women in pastel gowns, all smiling just a little too softly. Conversation dances around the edges of meaning, weather, lace, tea blends, anything but the loneliness that lingers like perfume. In 1860, social life is paradoxical. You're never truly alone, but you are rarely free. Chaperones hover, ensuring every walk is supervised, every letter screened. You host visitors, but your words are curated. You attend gatherings, but your opinions stay stitched inside your bodice. Some historians call it a culture of gentle surveillance. Others argue it was an invisible leash looped tightly through corset stays and etiquette books. Still bonds formed. In the small spaces between rules, women reach for each other. They passed notes in novels, stitched initials into shared samplers, left flowers with hidden meanings. A bouquet of violets didn't just look pretty, it whispered, "I'll remember." A certain thread color in your handkerchief, "I miss you." Letter writing became a lifeline. Pages folded with care, sealed with wax, carried not just news, but breath proof that someone else thought of you. Some wrote daily, others weekly, but always with caution. One wrong word, and your letter might be intercepted, misunderstood, or worse, mocked. Needlework circles were more than craft clubs. They were safe harbors. Between the thrum of thread and the click of thimbles, real conversations slipped through. Children's illnesses, husbands' tempers, quiet dreams. It was therapy by thread count. Here's a curious quirk: some women developed secret ciphers to keep prying eyes out of their letters. Codes hidden in cross-stitch patterns or messages written backward, only readable in mirrors. Historians are still decoding some of them today. Tiny rebellions stitched in silk. The irony. These friendships, these sisterhoods were often seen as mere pastimes, harmless fluff to pass the day. But for many women, they were survival. A whispered joke at a tea party could mean the difference between isolation and solidarity. A shared glance across the pew said more than 100 sermons. But it wasn't all warmth. Competition thrived too. Who wore the finest gloves, who secured the wealthiest husband, whose child recited Latin flawlessly. The pressure was constant and exhausting. Even friendships could fracture under the weight of expectation. One misplaced remark, one rumor, and your social circle could shrink overnight. Still, women persisted. They carved spaces in lace and parchment in parlor corners and garden benches. They built emotional economies where attention, kindness, and shared suffering held value. And while the world looked away, they held each other up. So tonight you fold your half-finished embroidery into a drawer. You reread the letter from your cousin, for the third time smile at the ink blot she tried to cover with a sketch of a cat and feel a flicker of warmth. In a world that insisted on your silence, another woman has heard you. You walk through the house, but it doesn't feel like yours. Every room, every hallway, every meticulously arranged vase is part of a system designed to contain you. The walls are painted soft colors, the furniture delicate and expensive, but the layout is unmistakably strategic. This is not a home, it's a domestic prison with floral wallpaper. In the 1860s, the ideal household wasn't just functional, it was moral architecture. The front parlor welcomed guests. The drawing room showed off taste. The nursery, kitchen, and servants' quarters were out of sight, because real life wasn't supposed to intrude on refinement. Women moved through these spaces like trained dancers, aware that any misstep could draw judgment. Even the staircases played a role. Grand enough to impress, but steep enough to remind you not to run. Scholars have debated whether these domestic designs were intentionally confining or simply reflective of the times. But it's hard to ignore how well the walls worked. Bedrooms were expected to be pristine, no hairbrush left out, no stockings hanging to dry, the bedspread smooth enough to balance a saucer. This wasn't just tidiness, it was surveillance by aesthetics. Every object whispered behave. Kitchens were technically your domain, but not your freedom. Unless you were lower class, you weren't expected to cook. That was for the help. Your job was to oversee the cook critique the goose plan, the menu. But never sweat, never knead, never salt with your own hand. And should you venture outside, even the garden had rules. No loud laughter, no bare feet. Gloves on even to snip roses. A woman in a garden was a painting come to life. Preferably oil on canvas, quiet, motionless, framed. One architectural oddity from this time, fainting rooms. Yes, actual rooms, sometimes just curtained alcoves set aside for when a woman felt overcome. Whether from tight corsets, emotional stress, or a particularly shocking letter, these spaces allowed her to disappear, briefly elegantly. Like a scene change in a very polite tragedy. Bathrooms limited, often shared, frequently cold. Privacy was a luxury, not a right. And if you needed a moment alone, not just for physical relief, but for silence, for breath. For yourself, you might find it only behind the water closet's thin door, or sitting by an open window at dawn before the house woke. Even bedtime had expectations. Hair must be braided skin, creamed prayers said aloud. You'd lie beneath heavy quilts, your hands folded just so, like a statue preparing for museum display. And still your mind would race. Did you say too much to the Reverend's wife? Did you serve the soup too hot? Did your child's cough sound worrying? The house was not a refuge. It was a stage, and you were always on. Every gesture rehearsed. Every room another act. So you tiptoe now, candle in hand, through these halls designed for stillness. Not because you fear the dark, but because you know the rules echo loudest when no one else is listening. You're seated at T Pinky, not quite extended, and suddenly aware of the weight of your eyebrows. Not their physical mass, but their placement. Too high you look startled, too low aloof. A woman's face in 1860 wasn't just a face, it was a message board, constantly being read for signs of propriety or rebellion. Etiquette was the unwritten law of your world, more binding than any statute. It governed not only what you said, but how you said it, when, and to whom. A mispronounced word, embarrassing. A direct gaze, improper. Speaking before being addressed, scandalous. Historians continue to debate whether Victorian etiquette empowered women with structure or shackled them with anxiety. But for you, every gesture felt like walking a tightrope in a hoop skirt. Even silence had rules. In conversation, a woman should speak just enough to show wit, but not enough to suggest opinion. If your laughter was too loud, you were vulgar. If you declined to laugh at all, you were cold. Smile sweetly, listen attentively, never interrupt, never outshine. Tea, for example, wasn't just a drink. It was choreography. The teacup must be held by the handle never looped through fingers. No clinking of the spoon against the china. Sugar, never honey. Lemon, but not milk, unless the blend was black. And for heaven's sake, don't slurp. That sound could exile you from polite society faster than a ruined hem. There's a delightful absurdity in some rules. Gloves must always be worn outdoors, but never when eating. A lady's fan should be used to cool her face, but also as a subtle signaling device. A flick left might mean let's chat, while a snap shut could mean not now. Some fans even came with instruction manuals, flirtation in 12 silent steps. Clothing, too, obeyed invisible codes. A woman in mourning had to wear black for a full year, then shift gradually through purples and grays before returning to color. Heaven forbid you showed up in lilac too soon after a death. It wasn't about grief, it was about optics. A curious fact. Etiquette books were among the best-selling volumes of the 19th century, outselling even novels in some regions. One titled The Habits of Good Society included advice on everything from glove sizes to the precise number of buttonholes appropriate for dinner attire. Spoiler, it's fewer than you think. But the most powerful rules were the ones no one wrote down. Who you could speak to, where you could sit, how you should enter a room. These unspoken codes created a hierarchy without walls. You didn't need chains to feel bound, you just needed a room full of raised eyebrows. Still, some women learned to weaponize etiquette. They used it to exclude rivals, charm patrons, maneuver through social ladders with grace disguised as modesty. Like chess players, they made silent moves that look like curtsies. So you sit now, your fingers resting on porcelain, your back perfectly straight. You've said nothing wrong. You've made no mistake. And yet, as the room continues to hum with judgment, you feel exhausted. Because playing by the rules was never the hard part. It was pretending the rules made sense. You glance down at your hands resting gently on your belly and feel a quiet dread. In 1860, pregnancy was not a celebration. It was a whisper, a shadow, something that happened to you, not something you discussed. The language turned clinical evasive. You weren't pregnant. You were in the family way. Publicly, you smiled, accepted congratulations, adjusted your dresses to accommodate the growing swell. Privately, you worried. Would this child survive? Would you? The odds were not kind. Complications abounded and medical care was patchy at best. One physician might prescribe laudanum for your nausea. Another might recommend a diet of toast and port wine. Scientific consensus. Nowhere to be found. Doctors were mostly male midwives, increasingly pushed out. Instruments were rudimentary. Sanitation inconsistent. Chloroform was starting to be used in some births if you were lucky and rich, but many still labored with nothing but grit and prayer. Historians note a gradual medicalization of childbirth during this period, but they disagree whether it helped or harmed more women in the short term. Most births took place at home. In the same room where you ate and slept and embroidered, a whole life would arrive or not. If things went wrong, you'd be surrounded by panicked whispers, vinegar cloths, and the faint metallic smell of blood. And if the child died, the silence that followed was suffocating. Women were expected to recover quietly, to move on quickly. Grief was private. Too much of it was unseemly. There's a haunting detail here: many women prepared tiny burial gowns alongside christening ones, just in case. Some even stitched names into both, hoping one would never be used. Even in healthy pregnancies, modesty was paramount. Maternity dresses were designed not to showcase the bump, but to conceal it. A woman in her third trimester might still be expected to host guests, pour tea, and never complain of back pain. Rest was encouraged, but only if you looked elegant while doing it. Advice books gave conflicting recommendations. Some insisted pregnant women avoid loud noises or vexing thoughts. Others suggested long walks and fresh air, but only in secluded areas. One guide even warned against watching theatrical performances lest the unborn child develop unsteady temperaments. What no one offered was emotional preparation, the fear, the hope, the strange intimacy of sharing your body with someone else. These were thoughts for your diary if you dared write them down. And even then you might choose your words carefully, knowing that your children or your husband could read them someday. And should the child arrive safely? Joy, yes, but also exhaustion, breastfeeding, swaddling, cleaning, soothing, all expected of you without complaint. You were praised as a mother even as you disappeared further into the role. So tonight you lie awake counting kicks beneath your stays, trying not to imagine the worst. You hum a lullaby under your breath, not for the baby, for yourself. A quiet prayer disguised as a melody drifting into the wallpapered dark. You sit upright at a desk that's too small in a classroom that smells faintly of chalk and varnish. The sun glints off the window panes, but you don't dare look out. A lady doesn't daydream, especially not when she's learning. Cautiously. In 1860, education for girls was a careful dance, encouraged but with strict boundaries. Reading, acceptable as long as the books were moral. Writing necessary, but preferably no more than journaling and polite correspondence. Arithmetic, yes for household management. Algebra, questionable. Too many variables might disturb your delicate sensibilities. Some schools admitted girls, particularly finishing schools or female seminaries. But the goal was refinement, not empowerment. You learned French not for diplomacy, but to read recipes. Music not for performance, but to fill parlor silence. Scholars still debate whether early women's education was progress or simply another cage disguised as culture. There's a curious rule here: girls were sometimes taught to write with their right hand, only even if naturally left-handed. Left-handedness was associated with unruliness, even rebellion. A tidy slant in your script wasn't just about legibility, it was about obedience. The books were heavily curated. Religious tracts, etiquette manuals, domestic guides. Science rare, philosophy occasionally. History, often rewritten to ensure you learned about brave men, gentle women, and never the messy parts. One woman's diary from the era notes being scolded for asking about revolutions. Ladies do not discuss upheaval, her teacher told her. It encourages passions. And yet behind the scenes, girls found ways to stretch. They exchanged novels under desks Jane Eyre passed like contraband. They wrote verses in the margins of hymnals. They asked questions that started innocently and led to places no lesson planned. Did Cleopatra rule wisely? Did Joan of Arc hear God, or just her own courage? Some families supported education, especially if they couldn't afford a dowry. An educated daughter might become a governess, a school teacher, a companion to a wealthier woman. Respectable jobs, if not exactly liberating ones. But many others feared what knowledge might do. A girl who read too much might become unmarriageable. Worse, she might have ideas. Here's a quirky detail: some boarding schools had silent hours in which girls were forbidden to speak even during meals. The goal, to instill discipline and inner reflection. The effect, whispered friendships forged through shared glances and scribbled notes passed beneath teacups. Education was not about curiosity. It was about preparation. You were being readied not for discovery, but for presentation. You'd recite poetry at dinner parties, correct the grammar in love, letters manage accounts for a household not yet yours, and smile all the while. But not every girl accepted the limit. Some memorized speeches by abolitionists. Some snuck into lectures meant for boys. Others, quietly radical, kept diaries full of questions no one else would hear. Why, one wrote, can I name the kings of England, but not the women who bled for them? So, you close your copybook, tuck the ink-stained handkerchief into your sleeve, and walk out into a world that prefers you. Clever, but not too clever. A mind sharpened just enough to trim roses. Nothing more. The house next door looks just like yours. White shutters, tidy hedges, lace curtains in the window. But if you listen closely past the polite clink of teaspoons and the rustle of newspapers, you might hear it, a voice raised just slightly, a tone too firm for embroidery. Someone inside that quiet house is breaking the rules. In 1860, rebellion didn't always look like torches and banners. Sometimes it wore a well-pressed bonnet and carried a basket of scones. The women who challenged the system were often the ones no one suspected: school teachers, Sunday organists, even a widow who hosted a reading circle. They knew the rules intimately. That's what made breaking them so effective. You might hear of a woman organizing a petition not for herself, of course, but on behalf of some poor family who'd lost their home. You might see another slipping pamphlets into hymnals, spreading whispers of suffrage and temperance reform. Scholars have long debated whether these actions were political or merely charitable, but you can feel the difference in the air. This wasn't just kindness, it was strategy. Some of the earliest suffragists began in the temperance movement. After all, no one could argue with a woman who wanted to stop public drunkenness. But once they gathered, once they organized other topics, followed voting rights, property laws, education reform. A woman with a clipboard could be more dangerous than one with a torch. And they weren't just in cities. Rural women organized too. In farm kitchens and church basements, they read papers aloud, shared speeches sent from Boston or London. The language was coded careful. The cause, they called it. Few named it directly, but all knew what was meant. One lesser-known tactic: quilting. Activist women would stitch political slogans into quilts, phrases like equal rights or liberty and justice, then raffle them at fairs. A cozy subversion, soft to the touch, sharp in intent. And some pushed further. They refused to marry. They wore bloomers' trousers disguised as skirt-adjacent garments that allowed freer movement. They took jobs, wrote under male pseudonyms, lived together in small collectives. These were not always loud revolutions, but they were deliberate daily ones. There's a remarkable account of one woman who taught enslaved girls to read in secret under the guise of embroidery lessons. Each stitch a syllable, each pattern a page. The risks were enormous, but the quiet resistance stitched its way through history. Of course, there was backlash. Newspapers mocked these women as hysterical spinsters. Clergy warned against the unraveling of domestic harmony. Families pressured daughters to stay quiet, stay pretty, stay home. And yet, the whispers continued. You return now to your side of the fence, eyes lingering on the curtains fluttering across the way. Was that a meeting? A lesson? A ziggy? A revolution wrapped in tea and biscuits? You're not sure, but you tuck the thought away like a pressed flower in a hymnal, a quiet keepsake of the possibility next door. You've just finished instructing the maid on how to starch the napkins again. She's 16 new and frankly better at folding than you were at her age. You thank her quietly because even now, you're not sure if it's kindness or condescension. The lines blur. In 1860, middle-class women were caught in a peculiar bind. They had servants yet still served. The Victorian household ran on appearances. Guests should believe everything ran effortlessly, which meant you had to manage the chaos while pretending it didn't exist. You weren't scrubbing floors, no, but you were inventorying the flour, overseeing the linens, and assigning which china was for which day. You were the project manager of domestic life, without the title, the pay, or the lunch break. Many households employed one or two maids, a general servant, maybe a cook if fortunate. But the lady of the house was still expected to maintain the social veneer. If the parlor curtains looked dingy, your fault. If the soup was late, also your fault. If the maid made a mistake, you were expected to correct her, not by example, but with grace and control. Discipline, after all, was a reflection of character. Some historians suggest this domestic supervision gave women a kind of managerial power, a domain of authority. Others argue it simply shifted the labor, one woman's rest resting squarely on another's back. There is no tidy consensus. One oddity: many women envied their servants not for their roles, but for their freedoms. A maid might walk to the market alone, laugh loudly in the kitchen, even receive letters from a sweetheart without censure. You, by contrast, were supposed to be invisible, graceful, contained, watching but not seen. You once overheard two maids gossiping in the pantry. One said her mistress didn't know how to sew on a button. You did, but you weren't allowed to. A lady with calloused fingers might as well be barefoot in the street. You wanted to defend yourself, but you also wanted to ask what it was like living slightly beyond the rules. Some employers were cruel, others maternal. Most were something stranger, polite but distant. You were supposed to know your servants' birthdays, but not their heartbreaks. Be invested in their health, but never too curious about their dreams. You managed people whose lives you were instructed not to fully see. In some homes, a subtle rebellion emerged. Maids took longer to return from errands. Cooks served soup with a bit too much salt. It was minor, even charming, until it wasn't. A whisper of disrespect was enough to justify dismissal. And so, the performances continued on both sides. But within the kitchen, laughter echoed. The rhythm of work made space for joy. And sometimes, you envied that music. Your own days were silent, dampened by etiquette obligation, and the need to be endlessly poised. So you hang up your bonnet nod to the maid polishing the banister, and wonder not for the first time who's freer, the woman with the keys to the pantry, or the one who knows where the bread is hidden. You flip through a family Bible searching for your grandmother's name. It's not there. Her husband's birth date is written in careful ink. Her son's marriage is noted with flourish. But she, the woman who bore 9 children, sewed every curtain in the house and lived to 93. She's a footnote, if that. Most women in 1860 never made it into the official record. Their stories weren't carved in marble or filed in archives. They were written in letters, now lost recipes without names, diaries that ended mid-sentence. Historians call it archival silence, a gap where voices should be. Birth certificates didn't always include mothers. Census takers listed wives only by first name, if at all. Legal documents favored men. A deed might read John Smith and wife, as though the wife were an accessory like a pocket watch or umbrella. Scholars continue to debate whether this invisibility was negligence or a deliberate erasure, But for those trying to reconstruct the past, the result is the same blank spaces. Curiously, one of the most detailed records of women's lives came from obituaries, and even those were inconsistent. A woman might be remembered for her virtues, her pies, her children, rarely for her thoughts. One paper praised a widow's quiet obedience and skill at doilies. Not a word about her surviving a winter alone with 5 mouths to feed. And yet these women were everywhere. They ran farms, doctored neighbors, managed shops after husbands died. Some even wrote under pen names or pseudonyms, publishing poetry in local gazettes. One woman in Maine sent weekly letters to a newspaper under the name Gentle Ink, gently skewering town gossip. No one guessed it was the blacksmith's wife. But these glimpses are rare. So much was oral passed down from mother to daughter, then forgotten. How to make a poultice for a fever. How to navigate a tense dinner without speaking a word. How to love someone you didn't choose. A peculiar detail in some regions, women were buried with items never recorded in their wills. Hair combs, letters, lockets. These were keepsakes only they knew the meaning of. A final act of silent storytelling. Church registries recorded baptisms and deaths, but not the years spent in between. School records noted attendance, but not achievement. Letters, if they survived, were often filtered through male eyes. My wife says hello. She is well. Full stop. Still traces linger. A pressed flower in a book. A faded name on quilt backing. A recipe titled Mother's Bread, with no mother listed. For every woman whose name made it to print, there were dozens whose lives shaped families, communities, entire towns, and vanished like steam off a kettle. So, you close the Bible, now fingers brushing over those neat but incomplete lines. You picture her, your grandmother in her apron, stirring soup with one hand and soothing a child with the other. No statue, no headline. But her absence speaks volumes. You hear her voice faint but steady, asking who remembers the ones who remembered everyone else. Your hand slips into the pocket, sewn discreetly inside your skirt. It's not much, just a fabric pouch tucked between layers, but in 1860, it's a secret space, a tiny rebellion. Inside a hairpin, a folded scrap of paper, perhaps a dried violet. Objects small enough to ignore, but meaningful enough to carry. This is resistance pocket-sized. Pockets weren't always hidden. Earlier centuries saw women wearing tie-on pockets over their shifts accessible and roomy. But by the mid-19th century, fashion had changed. Dresses clung closer to the body, silhouettes smoothed, and pockets, they shrank or vanished. A woman's freedom to carry her own things became unfashionable. Some historians call it coincidental. Others suspect something subtler. After all, it's harder to hide a diary when you don't have a place to put it. So, women improvised. They tucked coins in their stockings, letters in their gloves, keys on ribbons tied under corsets. Hairpins, once merely practical, became tools of quiet defiance. They held together more than curls they fastened. Hope-clamped secrets even served as impromptu lockpicks when needed. There are stories half-whispered of women hiding abolitionist pamphlets in reticules or pressing poison recipes between the pages of prayer books. Embroidery, too, told silent stories. On the surface, a sampler looked like flowers and alphabets, but certain symbols, caged birds, locked gates, wilted roses could carry private meaning. One stitcher might depict grief, another rebellion. Scholars have only begun to decode some of these textile messages. The line between art and protest, it seems, is a thread. Even diaries, those deeply personal confessions, weren't always safe. Many women wrote in code or used false names. They documented dreams they'd never speak aloud. Today I imagined owning a bookshop. Saw Mrs. T again. Her smile is a kind of light. These weren't declarations. They were quiet survival strategies. And though most of those notebooks are gone, The fragments that remain reveal minds buzzing beneath bonnets. There's a curious note found in a sewing box from 1862. If they ask, tell them I was mending. Nothing more. A cryptic footnote in someone's life. Was it a joke? A cover story? A final act of refusal? No one knows, but it lingers. Not every act was grand. Some women simply wore blue on days when they felt rage. Others refused to laugh at their husband's jokes. One woman kept a pet mouse in her drawer, feeding it crumbs from her own tea biscuits just to feel like something in the house answered only to her. Resistance didn't always shout. Often it whispered, it stitched, it hid things in sleeves and secret compartments. It waited for the moment not to strike, but to endure, to remember, to not forget oneself entirely. And so, you walk now, your pocket brushing against your hip. Inside, your fingers curl around a small folded page. It doesn't matter what's written on it. What matters is that it's yours, hidden but whole. A story within a story, carried quietly into the future. The fabric of resistance, it seems, was sewn not just into seams, but also breathed through soot. And just across town, in a place where dignity came second to matches, another kind of endurance flickered. You press open a rusted iron door and step into the dim, sulfur-heavy air of a London match factory in the 1860s. Inside, rows of young girls in aprons work silently beneath hanging oil lamps, dipping wooden splints into shallow troughs of white phosphorus. Their fingertips glow faintly. Their faces, powdered with dust, carry a sickly sheen. The youngest workers, some as young as 10, are called dip girls. Their job: to handle the phosphor paste, quick and efficient coating, hundreds of matches an hour. There's no ventilation. The paste seeps into the skin. Over time, their jawbones rot from the inside out, in a condition known as phossy jaw, a slow decay that starts with toothache and ends in facial collapse. And yet, they come back. The pay, meager as it is, can be the difference between bread and hunger for entire families. The factory fog smells of vinegar, smoke, and sweat. A matron shouts directions, her voice hoarse from years of breathing the same toxic cloud. You glance at the girls' shoes, many wear none. Their ankles are wrapped in rags. Yet some of them smile. They hum, tell jokes, steal moments of brightness between the danger. You wonder if they know the risks. Some do. Others are too new, too desperate. One might show you a coin she earned just that morning, already dreaming of jam tarts and a second-hand bonnet. Another rubs her jaw absently, the pain already whispering its slow arrival. Historians still debate why white phosphorus continued to be used long after safer alternatives existed. Was it cost ignorance, or simply the belief that working-class girls were expendable and what glowed beneath the soot, the matches, yes, but also a kind of fierce resilience? These girls lit more than fires. They lit rooms, homes, whole cities. And sometimes, when the factory was quiet, they'd strike a match just to watch it burn bright in the dark. Outside the factory, the air tastes better, but barely. You turn down a side alley where steam rises from wooden tubs and a different sort of labor takes shape. Laundry day every day for women who turn scrubbing into sovereignty. The morning clatter of buckets is its own kind of music. Women in rolled sleeves bend over washboards, sleeve-soaked faces flushed, their fingers red from soap and cold. This isn't domestic duty, it's a business. These women aren't just laundering drawers, they're laundering dreams, shillings at a time. In the 19th century, washerwoman was one of the most common ways for working-class women to earn money independently. Armed with soap lye and grit, they hauled linens by hand from mansion basements to communal troughs. Most couldn't read, but they kept ledgers in their heads, knew whose pillowcases needed starch, which husband always sent in collar stains suspiciously late. Unlike factory girls, washerwomen weren't confined by walls or bosses. They set their own hours, sometimes taking in dozens of clients a week. The strongest among them pushed handcarts stacked with wet linen across cobblestone streets, their backs bent like question marks. A successful laundress might even hire assistants, usually younger relatives or neighbors, and build a network of suds and trust. There was pride in the rhythm: soak, scrub, wring, rinse, repeat. They'd sing, argue, swap, gossip. Some charged extra for ironing, even more for mending. A good washerwoman became indispensable. She was there when a family hosted a funeral, a wedding, or prepared for a holiday. Her hands, rough and strong, smoothed the fabric of other people's lives. Quirky details peppered the trade. Some swore by secret mixtures: ashes from beechwood for brightness, urine for whitening wool. Others labeled their buckets with carved initials to prevent theft at the public washing stations, and a few carried homemade soap recipes passed down like family heirlooms. It wasn't glamorous. The work was damp, heavy, and exhausting, but it offered one rare thing: autonomy. These women handled cash. They set rates. They rejected rude customers. They made themselves known by name in neighborhoods that usually saw poor women as invisible. Some scholars argue that the wash tub was one of the first true tools of female entrepreneurship. Others contend the freedom was more illusion than reality. Scrubbing endless sheets for pennies barely lifted most out of poverty. But everyone agrees in a century that offered women few options, this one was both common and radical. And maybe the most radical thing, they didn't see themselves as extraordinary. They were just getting on with it, one load at a time. As the steam fades, a quieter space emerges: low ceilings, hushed voices, and the earthy scent of crushed herbs. You're in the home of a midwife, somewhere between science and superstition, where hands speak louder than words and silence is part of the job. Before hospitals were common, before men in coats with forceps claimed authority, women birthed the world, literally. Midwives were the guardians of life's beginning, present at births, deaths, and everything in between. Trained through apprenticeship or tradition, many couldn't read, but knew exactly how to ease pain with a poultice turn, a breech child, or recognize when labor had gone wrong. They weren't just birthing assistants. They were counselors, healers, grief holders, sometimes feared, sometimes revered. In many villages, a midwife's word held more weight than a priest's when it came to newborns and mothers. Their toolkit: boiled linens, herbal salves, sharp eyes, and instinct. Some carried carved wooden charms to comfort frightened mothers. Others swore by red thread to tie around a woman's wrist during labor, to distract pain, to protect, or just to hold on to something when screams became unbearable. It was messy work, sacred work. But as the 19th century advanced, the tides turned. Male doctors armed with new tools and degrees began to edge midwives out. Their methods weren't always safer. Many early physicians had no concept of sterilization. Yet their presence became a sign of progress. Hospitals began banning midwives. Licensing laws favored the literate, the male, the medically trained. There's no scholarly consensus on whether this shift actually improved maternal care. Some argue it reduced mortality. Others say it just erased centuries of female wisdom. What is certain is that many midwives disappeared from the record, not because they failed, but because they were written out. Still, their influence lingered. Mothers whispered their names. Babies were swaddled in blankets sewn by hands long gone. And some modern birth workers today trace their methods back, not to textbooks, but to old diaries. Recipes and oral tales passed down like secrets. One quirky tradition. Some midwives believed in birthing songs, tunes sung softly near the end of labor, meant to time breathing and soothe pain. Others buried the placenta with herbs to bless the child's path. Superstition. Maybe. But in a world with little else to ease pain, belief was its own kind of medicine. You imagine her now, this forgotten midwife, knotted hair linen apron, cracked hands rinsing in a basin. She doesn't seek glory. She just wants mother and child to survive the night. And in the dark, quiet after, as baby cries give way to exhausted sleep, she slips away another life, delivered another name, unrecorded. The sound changes again. No more cries or steam, just a rustle soft and constant like feathers turning in a breeze. You're now inside a dim attic workspace where women pluck, sort, and stitch the materials of warmth itself. Here, every pillow tells a story. Every comforter carries a secret. Feathers arrive in sacks, goose duck, sometimes even pigeon, still streaked with down, sometimes blood. The women don't flinch. They sit in circles, knees tucked under skirts tied up. One plucks, another trims. A third grades each feather by softness. No part of this is clean or quiet. Tiny tufts float like snow, clinging to hair and eyelashes. The air is thick enough to cough on. These workers were often called feather pluckers or quilters, but they were really artisans, especially those who stitched quilts each square, a tiny act of patience. Some stitched initials into hidden seams. Others hid scraps of old letters or handkerchiefs beneath the layers. Love, grief, even protest sewn into bedding, meant to soothe. Their hands move fast. In some shops, a seasoned plucker could process up to 1,000 feathers a day. In rural areas, it was community work neighbors gathered around shared heaps, chatting over tea and fingers blistered from barbs. The work wasn't always paid. Sometimes it was barter a week of plucking for a ham or 2 new dresses. A peculiar detail, feathers were often stored in sacks marked with family crests or initials. There were even cases of disputes when someone's prized goose down got mixed into a rival's pile. One 1830s anecdote tells of a full-on brawl between sisters-in-law over a misplaced bag of swan feathers, an inheritance apparently of considerable value. Historians debate the scale of these women's contribution to the bedding trade. Some argue their labor kept the industry afloat through wars and shortages. Others claim their role was exaggerated more folklore than fact. But all agree the quilts endured, and often the men who bought them never knew whose hands had made them. One woman might stitch quietly while her baby slept beside her. Another might add a square from a brother's old military coat. They didn't sign their work, but the care is still visible, in the tightness of a hem, in the exact match of a seam, in the feather-light whisper of something both handmade and haunting. Sometimes a finished quilt would be carried away in a cart sold to a wealthy household laid on a 4-poster bed. Other times, it stayed close wrapped around a newborn draped over a sick elder. These weren't just blankets. They were soft archives, made to be warmed, worn, wept on. And in attics like this, the air still holds their breath, their laughter, their lint-filled prayers. They sewed comfort. They stitched stories. And they left behind a softness the world almost forgot. From feathers to echoes. The next place you step into isn't a factory or a parlor. It's a stone bell tower in rural France where the scent is dust and old rope, and the only sound is the hush before a toll. Up the narrow steps, women wait with calloused hands on thick ropes, ready to ring time into being. Bell ringing was once considered sacred, musical, and deeply masculine. But in small parishes across 19th century France, when war took the men, or wages dipped too low, women took the ropes. They rang for births, for funerals, for Sunday Mass. The village clock, you realize, once beat to the rhythm of women's arms. The job was harder than it looked. Bell ropes could be thick as a wrist, and pulling them demanded rhythm, muscle, and an instinct for timing. Too fast, and the clapper slammed wrong. Too slow, and the sound fell flat. In some towns, women formed small bell guilds, taking shifts like fire watchers. Some even trained their daughters. One curious fact, The skin on their palms would develop thick ridges, tiny calligraphies of labor etched into flesh. Gloves helped sometimes, but most preferred to feel the rope raw to trust the rhythm with their hands. They worked high above the village in towers where owls nested and swallows flitted through broken windows. They weren't always welcomed. Priests sometimes frowned on women doing sacred work. Parish elders feared they'd gossip or bring scandal into the belfry. But bells had to be rung, and women were there, steady, punctual, precise. There's scholarly debate about how widespread female bell ringers truly were. Some historians insist it was rare and isolated. Others, drawing on oral histories and church records, argue it was more common than assumed, just underdocumented like so much of women's labor. Either way, these bell ringers left marks, sometimes literally scratches and initials carved into tower beams, signatures no one thought to erase. Or they left stories passed down. Your great-aunt rang the midnight bell when the war ended. She pulled the noonday chime every Sunday until her hands bled. One bell ringer named June reportedly gave birth between bell shifts and returned 3 days later, wrapping her newborn in a wool shawl and laying him beside the altar while she pulled the rope. A story, maybe, but it rings true. What's strange is how few portraits or mentions of them survive. Painters captured blacksmiths, seamstresses, shepherds, but almost never bellwomen, perhaps because they were in the air up high, half invisible. You imagine them now standing barefoot on wooden planks, the tower swaying slightly as the bell begins to swing. A low rumble, a rising note, and a sound that vibrates not just in the ear, but the ribs. No crowd, no applause, just time kept faithfully. They didn't need recognition. Their song was the hour itself, and the village listened whether it knew who was ringing or not. Back on solid ground, your footsteps lead to quieter labor, again this time with the scent of thread wax and faint mildew. You find yourself in a cramped tenement room where women crouch under flickering candlelight, stitching the soles of other people's shoes. You've met the shoebinders and seamstresses. This is work that travels, but not its makers. The shoes they finish may grace polished drawing rooms, march through battlefields, or tap across theater stages. But the women who assemble them, they stay still often for 14 hours a day, bent over leather and linen with needles that prick faster than thought. In the 19th century, thousands of women stitched shoes and garments from home. Outwork, they called it, factory labor without the factory. It was cheaper for manufacturers and gave women a way to earn at home. But with it came isolation, low pay, and relentless quotas. Most earn per piece. Sew faster, get more pennies. Fall behind, lose the job. Shoebinders attached uppers to soles with waxed thread, often sitting cross-legged on floors to get better leverage. Seamstresses did it all, bodices, hems, buttons, sometimes fancy lace if the client paid. They worked in silence, occasionally humming or muttering to themselves. The best had rhythm in their fingers, like pianists no one clapped for. Their wages were threadbare. A full week's worth of stitching might buy a loaf of bread and a slab of cheese. But still they worked because it was one of the few trades open to respectable women. It didn't require them to leave home. It didn't demand they speak with strangers. It allowed them barely to remain invisible. There's a strange pride in that invisibility. One quirky detail. Many seamstresses gave nicknames to their best needles, calling them Old Faithful or Lucky Girl. Some believed using the same needle each morning would ward off drop stitches. Others stitched tiny initials into seams where no one would see little proof they'd been there at all. Scholars remain divided on how empowering this labor really was. Some argue that it gave women control over their time and modest incomes. Others insist it trapped them in unpaid domestic work masked as freedom. The truth, as always, lies in between quiet endurance disguised as choice. Occasionally, a finished dress would appear in a shop window, and a seamstress might linger nearby just to see her work admired. She wouldn't speak, but she'd notice. And then she'd go back home to patch another collar, finish another hem. One anecdote tells of a woman who stitched evening gloves for an actress she'd never meet. The gloves were praised in a newspaper. The actress took the spotlight, but the stitcher had tied a pale blue thread into the lining just for herself, her signature invisible and soft. These were women who touched the world, stitch by stitch, and were rarely touched in return. You wander from the needle light into the shadows of another kind ones, cast by flickering candles, herbal smoke, and whispered fortunes. In small cottages, cramped city flats, or tucked-away forest huts, a different kind of trade thrives. Here women trade in mystery. You've arrived at the domain of the fortune-tellers and cunning women. Forget crystal balls and thunderclaps. Most of these women didn't claim magic. They read tea leaves, tarot cards, palms, or the shape of your cough. They brewed potions, offered advice, and sometimes warned you not to travel by the West Road this week. People laughed in public and came back in secret. In the 19th century, especially in rural England and parts of Ireland, cunning folk were unofficial neighborhood therapists, medics, and problem solvers. You needed to find a lost cow. They had a charm for that. Worried about your sweetheart's fidelity, they'd burn a lock of hair in a bowl and tell you what the smoke meant. Their tools were often simple herbs, worn books, bone dice, and observation. One peculiar detail many fortune-tellers used: peeled apple skins to divine initials of future lovers. They'd toss the peel over a shoulder and squint at the letter it formed on the floor. Quirky, yes, but also a rare moment of agency in a time when women's futures were often decided by others. These trades were partly performance. A fortune-teller knew how to hold silence, tilt her head just right, let you fill in your own fears. Some had actual training passed down through families and coded recipes and rituals. Others picked up the craft out of necessity. A widow with 3 mouths to feed might decide to become the local seer, with little more than intuition and dramatic timing. Authorities frowned on these practices. Some women were fined, others imprisoned. A few were even tried under old witchcraft laws, which lingered surprisingly long on the books. Yet, demand never disappeared. Even city folk deep in the age of reason would quietly visit a cunning woman when logic failed them. Historians debate how sincerely these women believed in their own work. Some clearly did. Others admitted later in life that it was just a game, a means of survival. But no one disputes their role as social fixtures, especially among women who found in them a rare source of control and understanding. These were places where secrets could breathe, where questions found odd answers, and where the clink of a coin paid not for truth, but for hope. You picture her now, hunched at a small table, scarf tied tight, cards fanned like feathers. She looks at you not to see the future, but to remind you that you still have choices. The air smells like dried lavender and candle wax. You feel something unspoken stir. Not magic exactly, but something close. The hush grows deeper as you step into a room full of fine furniture, polished silver, and silence. No chatter, no laughter. Just the quiet presence of a woman who belongs but doesn't. You're in the private world of the 19th century governess, a figure both central and ghostly in the houses she served. She sits near the window, a book open but untouched, watching the rain. Her pupils, young daughters of merchants, nobles, or diplomats, are upstairs embroidering or practicing scales on a distant piano. She will correct their French later, gently, precisely, and they will both love and resent her for it. A governess was neither servant nor family. She lived among privilege, but was allowed none of it. Paid a small salary, she ate meals alone, walked alone, and was expected to vanish from the drawing room when guests arrived. Her job was to educate daughters in languages, manners, art, and sometimes arithmetic, everything necessary to make them marriageable, yet not too clever. Most governesses came from fallen middle-class families, daughters of clergymen, bankrupt traders, or widowed schoolmasters. They had education breeding and no money. Teaching became their only respectable option. The work was often lonely, intellectually stifling, and emotionally complicated. How do you teach a girl to command a household when you can't even choose your own dinner? A curious detail. Many governesses kept private journals in shorthand, not just to record their feelings, but to protect themselves. Accusations of impropriety or incompetence could end a career. Writing in code offered a shield. Some entries were later published, revealing bitterness, affection, and an odd simmering pride in their invisible power. Historians disagree on how much influence these women actually had. Some say they were vital culture bearers, shaping future mothers and quiet rebels. Others see them as victims of a cruel system, imprisoned in parlors of genteel neglect. What's clear is that they knew everything about the families they served and were remembered by almost none of them. One governess, Miss Eliza W., taught in 4 countries over 30 years. She spoke 5 languages, played concert piano, and was once mistaken for a Polish countess. She died in a boarding house with nothing but her notebooks. Inside one, a list of every girl she ever taught, and beside each name, a single word: brilliant, unruly, invisible. Some girls idolized their governess. Others ignored her entirely. A few would sneak back at night to ask questions they couldn't ask their mothers. How do you know if it's love? What happens if you say no? And always, the governess answered gently, knowing she was not allowed to speak from experience. You see her now smoothing her skirt, adjusting her cuffs, preparing to ask politely for the evening off, though she has nowhere to go. Her world is made of borrowed space, borrowed time, and a job that vanishes the moment her charges marry. She is elegant, educated, and utterly alone. And still, she turns the page. Now the room grows darker, inkier, as you step into a cramped shop tucked between a printmaker and a spice merchant. Inside it, smells of parchment glue and iron gall ink. At the counter stands a woman with ink-stained fingers and a knowing look. Welcome to the world of women who made ink scribes, pigment grinders, and clandestine copyists whose hands shaped what others read. In the 19th century, before mass literacy truly exploded, and long before ballpoint pens ink wasn't something you simply bought off a shelf. It was mixed brewed, coaxed into being. Recipes varied by region, but many involved boiling oak galls, scraping soot-crushing minerals. And some of the most precise and patient ink makers, women. Some worked in stationers' shops, officially assisting husbands or brothers. Others labored behind convent walls in private homes, or as part of underground networks that copied political tracts, banned books, or risque novels. Their tools were humble mortars, tiny scales, feather quills, and linen blotting cloths. There's no scholarly consensus on how many women participated in this trade directly. Records are vague. Many were listed as assistants' daughters, or not listed at all. But historians have traced entire batches of ink and style-specific copying back to anonymous female hands by comparing handwriting ink compositions, even the scent left on paper fibers. A quirky tradition. Some ink makers would press a single flower petal into the cork of a newly sealed ink bottle, supposedly for luck or love, or to ensure smooth writing. Others dabbed a dot of ink on the back of their hand each morning to test its dryness, not just for function, but to leave a mark, a badge, a stain of quiet pride. Women copyists were especially vital in legal and clerical offices, where before typewriters, every letter, ledger, and proclamation had to be written by hand. Speed mattered, so did elegance. They practiced endlessly perfecting flourishes and consistency, competing with each other in quiet, private contests. Who could copy a page fastest without a single smudge? Their wrists ached, their eyes strained. And yet many wrote until their hands trembled from age. Some even slept with their quills under the pillow, believing it sharpened their memory. One tale survives of a woman named Beatrix, a copyist in Brussels, who added a single unauthorized line to every document she transcribed, a phrase from a banned poet hidden in the margin just for herself. The ink remembers it read, "No one noticed," until years later, a scholar found the phrase repeated across dozens of anonymous manuscripts. Historians still debate whether she was a rebel or a romantic. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. But her ink, even centuries later, speaks. You see her now, hands blackened at the tips, apron-crisp face lit by lamplight. She dips her pen, breathes, and draws the first perfect letter on a new page. It's not her name. It never will be. But it's her work nonetheless. Letter by letter, sentence by sentence. The cobblestones rattle beneath you, now not from passing carriages, but from the thud and creak of something more human. A woman, shoulders bowed under the yoke of a wooden cart, trudges forward like an ox. You've arrived among the cart women of Paris laborers, whose lives moved quite literally on wheels. In 19th century Paris, streets buzzed with commerce, and carts were everywhere hauling firewood, bricks, vegetables, laundry, even human waste. But not all carts were pulled by horses. When a delivery needed doing, but a beast couldn't be spared, the job often fell to women. These were les charretières, female cart pullers, part draft, horse, part day laborer, all muscle. They weren't caricatures of toughness. They were toughness. Small-framed women in aprons and headscarves, gripping the shafts of makeshift wooden carts, hauling hundreds of pounds across narrow bridges and slick market lanes. Their boots were worn to the sole, their hands calloused and cracked, yet they moved with practiced efficiency, part rhythm, part stubbornness. This wasn't an occasional task. For many, it was daily labor essential to market logistics, especially in poorer districts. Some rented their carts by the hour, others owned their own and took pride in their roots. There are anecdotes of women racing each other through alleys, laughing even as they wheezed for breath. And still, they were paid a fraction of what mail haulers earned. A man pulling timber might get 6 francs. A woman, for the same distance with just as much weight, 2, sometimes 1. It was assumed, of course, that she was doing what she could until a man could replace her. But many of these women had no such replacement. Widows, unmarried mothers, or daughters supporting ill parents, they filled the city's arteries when no one else would. A peculiar local custom saw some cart women paint charms or saints on the boards of their carts, like protective tattoos for the journey. Sainte Geneviève, patroness of Paris, was a favorite. Scholars remain divided on how widespread the trade truly was. Some claim these women were rare outliers. Others argue they formed a critical but hidden workforce, overshadowed by flashier stories of revolution and salons. Whatever the case, they left ruts in the streets and bruises that lingered in family stories. One woman, Madeleine, was said to pull her cart with a broken ankle wrapped in cloth. Another, Annette, had 8 children, and a circuit from the Seine to Montmartre 12 miles a day, hauling soap and coal, her route so regular that passers-by knew the time by her passing. Their strength was not showy. It was the kind that didn't ask permission, and their silence wasn't compliance, it was efficiency. You picture one now stopping at a curb, wiping her brow with a sooty sleeve. She checks her load, adjusts the straps, and moves on. No one claps. But somewhere, a loaf of bread is baked, a stove is lit. A shop opens on time because she arrived. She didn't wait for dignity. She pulled it behind her all the way. Now the city fades behind you, replaced by the scent of crushed thyme, damp soil, and something faintly medicinal. You're in a cottage garden at the edge of a village fence lined with twigs herbs blooming in uneven rows. Here lived the herbalists and healers' women, whose medicine grew from the ground up. Before pharmacies dotted every corner, and long before pills came in, blister packs care began with dirt-stained fingers, and knowledge passed from mother to daughter. These women weren't doctors, not officially. But they had remedies for coughs, fevers, toothaches, and despair, calendula for wounds, elderberry for colds, valerian for sleeplessness. They weren't always solitary figures. Some ran modest apothecaries, others wandered with baskets from house to house. And many worked in secret, especially after laws tightened and male-dominated medical colleges began monopolizing real knowledge. Still, when a child burned his hand or a woman couldn't stop bleeding after birth, it wasn't a surgeon people called. It was her. Herbalists didn't just cure bodies, they soothed minds. They listened comforted brewed teas that tasted like forests. One quirky detail, some tucked handwritten receipt books inside cooking pots or behind fireplace bricks, filled with plant lore and notes in spidery script. A sprig of rue for sorrow, boiled willow bark for the grief that won't let go. There's still scholarly disagreement about how effective their treatments truly were. Some recipes bordered on superstition. Others, like garlic poultices and chamomile infusions, are now backed by science. What's clear is that their work bridged the emotional with the physical. You didn't just leave their garden healed. You left herd. One known herbalist, known only as Nanette in surviving letters, kept a garden with over 300 documented plants. She labeled each with wood slats and folklore notes, good for melancholy, chases night demons, protects from envy. She was eventually fined for practicing without license, but locals kept visiting, quietly, always at dusk. These women walked a line between tradition and transgression. In some towns, they were cherished, in others, feared. More than one was accused of witchcraft long after such charges had lost legal meaning. The word lingered anyway, like smoke. Their tools, a mortar and pestle, a rusting sickle, a heart trained to read symptoms like poetry, and above all memory, the kind that knew when to harvest, how long to steep, and exactly which leaf turned bitter just before it turned useful. You see her now in her garden skirt, wet with dew, fingers brushing a rosemary stalk. A child waits on the bench, eyes red from crying. She doesn't ask what's wrong. She simply brews something warm, hums an old song, and hands over a cup. This isn't modern medicine. It's something slower, older, sometimes softer, sometimes stranger, but never less real. And in those quiet gardens behind crooked fences and between overgrown paths, healing took root in places no textbook ever mapped. The scent of herbs fades, replaced by something dry and musty leather dust and ink. You find yourself in the back of a print shop, wedged between stacks of unbound pages and the creak of a hand-crank press. At a long table under a single swinging lamp, women in bonnets stitch books they'll never read. These are the bookbinders. They work quietly with the precision of watchmakers. Their fingers agile from years of sewing, move through signatures, those folded bundles of pages piercing, threading, knotting. Some bind pamphlets. Others stitch novels or religious texts. Many don't know what they're assembling. They just follow the collation mark's tiny printer's cues that guide their order. In the 19th century, bookbinding was one of the few acceptable trades for women that didn't involve food or fabric. It was seen as an extension of needlework. But the irony. These women made the very things they were often forbidden to explore. Deeply books of politics, philosophy, or science. One curious habit: some women stitched their initials into the spine lining hidden beneath the leather. A secret claim. Others pressed a thumbprint onto the flyleaf before the cover went on a quiet, "I was here." These traces rarely survived rebinding or decay, but once in a while they're discovered by conservationists decades or centuries later. They sat for hours at long benches, sometimes in silence, sometimes in bursts of chatter. Topics range from rent and romance to whether a certain character in a serialized novel deserved his fate. A shared book might be read aloud in stolen snatches passed between breaks. Occasionally, someone would cry at a plot twist they hadn't stitched yet. There's still academic debate over how central women were in the bookbinding trade. Some argue they were peripheral, brought in for simple folding and sewing. Others believe they held whole workshops together, doing fine gilding and spine work that went undocumented. Surviving payslips suggest they were paid less for the same work, but not always much less. In some towns, skilled female binders were sought after. One famous binder, Margaret T., reportedly stitched a copy of Les Miserables in under 4 days. She never read. It didn't speak French. But she told her sister she could tell it was a sad one by the weight of the ending. They worked with paper that sliced like knives and thread that left burns. Some wrapped their fingers in scraps of muslin or soaked them in vinegar after long shifts. A few developed a condition now known as binder's claw, a stiff curl from years of repetitive stitching. You see one now, sitting straight-backed linen bonnet tied tight, threading a crimson ribbon into the spine of a devotional. Her face is calm, but her eyes dart counting pages, catching errors, racing time. The book will be read by a stranger. It will be shelved, handled, cherished, or tossed. She'll never know. But somewhere between page 14 and 15, her hand passed through. You leave the print shop behind and find yourself standing at a gate. Not a metaphorical one, an actual toll gate creaking on its hinges beside a muddy country road. There, bundled in shawls against the wind, stands a woman with a small wooden stool and a leather coin pouch. She is a toll keeper, and this road passes through her hands. In the 19th century, many small roads across Britain, Ireland, and parts of rural Europe were privately maintained and required payment to use. Toll keepers, often widows, spinsters, or wives of roadmen, were hired to man the booths, or rather, woman them. They lived in tiny stone lodges beside the road, keeping watch day and night for carts, wagons, livestock, and the occasional stray traveler. It wasn't glamorous. Their job was to step out in all weather demand, tolls politely issue receipts, and when necessary, refuse passage. Some were spat at, others bribed, but most stood firm even when their authority was questioned by men unused to being told not without a penny. One peculiar tradition, some toll keepers kept ledgers not only for payments, but for gossip. Farmer H passed with 3 geese, did not return. Or Mr. Parsons' daughter came alone again. These side notes were rarely official, but read like a secret social diary of the road. Toll rates varied depending on what you carried: 2 pence for a cart, half a penny for a single sheep. Some gates had leeway hours for funeral processions or deliveries of milk. A few toll keeper women became so familiar with local traffic that they could tell who was coming by the sound of wheels on gravel. There's debate among historians about how much power these women truly had. Some say they were mere figureheads watched by male supervisors. Others insist they enforced real control, holding keys to gates, fining trespassers, and even detaining wagons until debts were paid. One woman, Mrs. Delia R., reportedly stopped a runaway horse cart by slamming the toll gate closed and standing in front of it with her arms crossed. She broke her ankle, but the gate held. Better a bone than a baby, she reportedly told the constable afterward. Most toll keepers lived in isolation. Their lodges were often just one room, with a stove, a cot, and a tiny window facing the road. They might go days without conversation and weeks without kindness. But they kept the roads running. Literally. Some lodged travelers overnight. Others fed orphans. A few, legend has it, kept pet foxes or hens that roamed the road freely. Half mascots, half companions. They created lives in the margins inside thresholds everyone else rushed past. You see her now, rising slowly from her stool as a creaky wagon approaches. She squints into the drizzle steps. Forward opens her hand. The toll is paid. The gate swings open, and the world moves through her. The gate fades behind you, and now your path winds indoors again, into a room filled with scratching sounds. Not mice, not chalk, but pens. Dozens of them moving in rhythmic harmony across paper. You've entered the realm of the pen ladies, female copyists who earn their living one careful letter at a time. Before typewriters became common, and long before carbon paper, every formal document had to be written by hand. Legal briefs, sermons, company ledgers, invitations, even full-length books. And for many years in the 19th century, a surprising number of these were penned by women, quietly, precisely, for hire. Copying work required discipline, a strong wrist, near-perfect eyesight, and an ability to resist boredom when transcribing page after page of dry bureaucratic text. Most pen ladies were unmarried or widowed, often working from home or in small office collectives. Their tools: dip pens, ink pots, blotting cloths, and a ruler to keep lines straight. The pay was modest, but the independence was rare. Unlike housemaids or shop girls, copyists worked largely on their own terms. Some chose their clients. Some even set their own rates. And because their writing had to match formal styles, many practiced calligraphy in the margins of grocery lists, just to keep their hands in shape. A charming habit among some pen ladies, they kept ink diaries, small journals of beautiful phrases they encountered while copying documents. One woman recorded over 400 lines from sermons and court speeches, noting which made her laugh or cry. Another pasted rejected pages into scrapbooks and turned them into paper dolls for her niece. There's little scholarly agreement on how widespread this profession was. Many female copyists went unrecorded, paid in cash under the table, or listed on census forms as simply clerical assistant. But their handwriting survives, distinctive curls, flourishes, and steady lines in archives across Europe and America. One copyist, Miss Ada F., became quietly famous in her town for reproducing legal texts so accurately that judges refused to accept versions written by anyone else. When a new clerk asked how to identify her work, a bailiff simply said, "Look for the script that breathes." Pen ladies were rarely credited. Their names didn't appear on the documents they copied, but their presence was unmistakable to those who read closely. A certain grace in the spacing, a modest flourish at the end of a paragraph, a faint scent of lavender where the ink dried. They lived by repetition, signatures, clauses, salutations, and yet they often brought a small poetry to even the most mundane lines. One might slip a barely visible doodle of a rose between two line breaks. Another might write an entire page while listening to the rain and later swear it influenced her rhythm. You picture her now, sleeves rolled, candle flickering, wrist steady. She dips her pen breathes and continues the sentence as if it's music. Her name is not on the page, but her touch is. At last, you enter the quietest room of all a room, not in any house or workshop, but in your imagination. Dust motes hang in the air. A beam of soft light touches a shelf where aprons lie folded cotton wool, linen stained and faded. This is the archive of the forgotten, the closing chapter of trades so ordinary they slip through history's cracks. No signs, no labels, no fanfare, just aprons. But each one holds the imprint of work once done: soap-bleached patches from laundresses, singed edges from kitchen fires, a tiny ink blot from a copyist's lap. These garments carried labor soaked up days, endured the heat and grime of toil, then vanished when no one needed them anymore. In the 19th century, aprons were more than just garments. They were uniforms, tools, and sometimes shields. Women wore them across every class, and trade embroidered at the top, patched at the hem, stiff with starch or soft with wear. A cook's apron had deep pockets for spices. A seamstress's had pins and chalk. A toll-keeper's might carry coins, folded notes, even a key. One peculiar habit: some women stitched tiny charms or prayers into the seams of their aprons, hidden talismans against injury, heartbreak, or bad luck. Others hemmed the edges with family thread, passed down from mothers and aunts, a whisper of continuity stitched into each shift. There's no scholarly consensus on how to document trades that left no ledgers. The jobs were too small, too scattered, and yet their impact was immense. They fed cities, cared for the sick, kept roads open, babies breathing, garments sewn, and books bound. They held the world together while the world forgot to write them down. Take the knocker-upper, a woman who tapped on windows with a long stick to wake workers before alarm clocks, or the street lantern lighters paid by the match to walk a dozen miles a night. They earned pennies. They vanished from the census, but their presence lingered in the rhythm of daily life. You see them now, all of them matchstick girls with glowing jaws, washerwomen with red hands, bell ringers in shadowed towers, herbalists in the garden mist. And you see their aprons folded not with reverence but with routine, laid aside after use, forgotten not out of disrespect, but from the sheer passage of time. They were not queens or inventors. They didn't write laws, but their fingerprints, often smudged, often scrubbed, are still on everything. They cooked, they carried, they comforted, they stitched, and when the day ended, they untied their aprons, folded them, and waited for morning. So as you sit now in the hush of night, remember, behind every empire, every war, every invention, there were women you've never heard of, doing jobs you've never thought about, wearing aprons you'll never see. But they were here. They worked, and the world turned quietly because of them. Now let the details blur like ink in warm water. Let the toll gates close softly. Let the last feather settle in the quiet. The women we've met tonight didn't ask to be remembered. Most didn't even think anyone would care. But their trades, their tired hands and sharp minds left traces all the same, in the spine of a book, in the fold of a quilt, in the hush of a church bell swinging in the dark. As your thoughts drift, maybe you picture one apron, faded, patched, but sturdy. Maybe you remember the feel of steam on your skin or the whisper of pen on paper. These fragments will keep working while you sleep. If you'd like to return to stories like this, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, where are you? What time is it, and who's your favorite forgotten historical figure?